Netflix is producing a new adaptation of C.S. Lewis's beloved Chronicles of Narnia. And this Narnia fan is a little scared. With all the trends floating around Hollywood for movie adaptations, and with how many of them go horribly wrong, I find it a little hard to believe that this one will go anywhere close to right. There seemed to be just one way that Gerwig can make a good adaptation of Narnia, but here are at least 5 ways that she can make a bad one. After giving it some more thought, I've come up with about 5 ways that I think Gerwig and Netflix can make a bad adaptation of Narnia. And I wouldn't say that I'm not hopeful. I'm definitely hopeful. But I don't know. It's still a risky prospect to me. And the way that movie culture is right now in general, I feel like makes it even more risky. I've gotten my hopes up a lot, even recently, and those hopes have been consistently dashed. Not on Narnia, on different things. And so, despite however hopeful I can be and whatever reasons I can find to be hopeful, I'm still a little skeptical. So, let's get into some of these reasons. So, the way number one that I think this could go really wrong is by doing, I guess what I'm kind of labeling as a live-action Disney adaptation. What I mean by that is, we have the books, the Narnia books. We have some live-action movies already made by Disney a while ago, and Disney's live-action adaptations of their cartoons. Now, this is an adaptation from a book to a movie, or theoretically from a different movie to a different live-action movie to a new live-action movie or show. There's a little bit of difference there, but Disney, over the last little while, has been taking their cartoons and turning them into live-action movies. And they do this in pretty standard way. They tend to be, not always, but they tend to be pretty bland remakes of the previous films with very little modification, and honestly not that interesting. And I feel like they've gotten less interesting as they've continued to do this. Some of the early ones were, I think, better. They were also new, and that was kind of an exciting concept, and now it's just worn off. And so in this situation, they really would be taking a book and turning it into a movie, which is different than taking a movie of one form and turning it into a movie of another form. But the same kind of spirit can guide the creative process. They might just try to copy and paste the book into movie form, or a previous movie into a new movie. And I think both of those are probably not the right way to go. I want them to stay very close to the book. More importantly, I want them to capture the spirit of the book. But I think if they try... A movie's a different thing than a book. And so if you're trying to copy and paste, you're going to lose some things in translation anyway. And so you have to take some creative license just by the fact that you're dealing with a different artistic medium. And so I want them to do that while retaining the spirit of Lewis and Narnia authentically. So creating a bland adaptation that doesn't really go anywhere new, or doesn't really flesh anything out, or doesn't really meet the medium properly, I think could be a problem. And this trend of Disney adaptations that kind of trace that same line, I think could be tempting bait for Netflix and Gerwig. Reason number 2, or thing number 2 that I think they need to avoid, is creating a dark adult version. Now, this was more popular about 5-10 years ago, and I think the trend has kind of died out, and I hope it stays dead. But I'm thinking of things like Snow White and the Huntsman, or the darker Alice in Wonderland, things like that. We don't need a dark adult version of Narnia. We don't need a mature version of Narnia. We need the whimsical, childlike version of Narnia that Lewis gives us. And that is part of this spirit that I hope they're able to pull through to the screen from the book. That was something that Lewis was very intentional about doing with the books, and I think that needs to come through in the movies as well. Now, I want it to be mature in the sense that it's sophisticated, that it's done well, that it is appealing to people that are not children, people who are older, but I want it to keep that whimsical spirit. I don't want it to be a pessimistic, dark take on Narnia. Again, I think this one's probably less likely than maybe any of the other things on the list, but it is a thing that we have seen in the past, and it's a trend that they could very well try and continue. Thing number 3 they need to avoid is letting the spirit of the age dictate the terms of telling this story again. And by this I do mean several things, or I have several examples floating in the back of my mind. Rings of Power is a good example. The live action Avatar: The Last Airbender series on Netflix that they just did is another good example of this. In Rings of Power, the spirit of the age operates over the spirit of Tolkien. In fact, they twist him so much that it's no longer Tolkien's philosophy that's operating in the show. It's the philosophy of our contemporary political pundits, really. They do such a horrible job of capturing the spirit of Tolkien that it really, I mean, besides claiming to be in the same world and having a lot of the same characters and potential features, it doesn't really feel like Middle-earth. And the reason for that is that Tolkien had a certain philosophy, and the writers have the opposite philosophy, and they've infused the story with their own philosophy and not Tolkien's. And I'm afraid that something like this could happen to Narnia. The live action Avatar: The Last Airbender, great example of how this happened in it. Uncle Iroh is one of the most beloved characters in the cartoon, and not that he's not lovable in the live action, but his philosophy in the live action is the exact opposite of his philosophy in the original cartoon. In the live action, he's all about innovation and trying new things and experimenting and growing and progressing. In the cartoon, he's all about the wisdom of the past and conservation, trying to save and restore things. And this progressivist spirit that has captured the Fire Nation, that's driving industry and driving their war, is the thing that he's fighting against. And in the live action, this is reversed. In the cartoon, he's trying to teach Zuko to not adopt the philosophy of the Fire Nation, but adopt the philosophy that it used to hold before that, before this industrialization and war. And in the show, the Fire Nation is seen as traditional now and wanting to spread their traditional values. And he's being the progressive, telling them to reject all of that. And I'm not trying to make a political statement here about conservative and progressive and all of that. I'm just espousing the way that these terms apply to the story. And so, but you can see that there's a distinct difference in the way that Uncle Iroh operates. I fear that something like that could happen in Narnia. I don't want this whimsical fictional world with very specific fictional characters who experience very specific fictional things that Lewis is trying to make certain points through, and less trying to make certain points through and more letting them embody his philosophy. I don't want that to be captured by the spirit of the age and by the spirit of another author. And I'm afraid that they could. And I've seen people on Reddit talking about how If it's not a Christian who's making Narnia, then it's not going to be Narnia. And I mean, newsflash: the last Narnia movies weren't made by a Christian, at least to my knowledge. In fact, I think it's the opposite. And so, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was a very good adaptation. So I'm not saying that it has to be made by a Christian. I'm just saying that it has to be made by someone who isn't going to infuse the story with their own political agendas or philosophical agendas, or you name it. Greta Gerwig has been accused of the heresy of wokeism, and I think that those accusations do apply to her in general. But in viewing some of her other works that were adaptations, so Little Women was an adaptation of a book. She did let some of her own perspectives and agendas weigh into that adaptation in a way that I've been told breaks from the way certain characters operated. So I'm afraid that can happen again. And so this is the one that I think, if one is going to happen, it's probably going to be this one. And this is the one that I'm the most scared for. Thing number 4 to avoid is letting this be an unrestrained outlet for her religious wrestling. So Lady Bird, she's dealing a lot with wrestling a lot with her religious upbringing, and this would be a great way of doing that again. And notice I said unrestrained outlet. I do think that it is appropriate for her to do something similar with Narnia in trying to work out some of her own religious wrestlings. I think that's perfectly appropriate. But she has to let Lewis's final word stand in the story. She can't... I hope, actually, that she comes to these stories with her questions, with her desire to wrestle, but lets Lewis drive the agenda instead of driving it herself. I think if she threads that needle properly, if she's restrained in letting herself come through and in letting Lewis come through, and she does it properly, that could actually make for the most interesting adaptation. And so this one I see as one of the bigger threats, but also one of the biggest moments of potential. So I do hope that she actively engages with some of the things that Lewis is doing and some of her own wrestlings and lets them shine through. It could be fruitful for her to carry forward underlying themes that's Alistair McGrath, for instance, talks about, in which the Pevensey children and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there's a question about, do we listen to the narrative that Aslan is telling us, or do we listen to the narrative of the White Witch? And do we doubt Aslan? That's one of the underlying themes of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, especially as Alistair McGrath reads it. And I think that's, if she's struggling with that kind of question in her faith, that could be a good one for her to engage in these stories. But she can't change Lewis's answer to the question being asked. If she does that, then you no longer have an authentic adaptation of Narnia. You have a twisted version. So then, thing number 5 to avoid is just missing the point of the story she's telling. I think this kind of reflects Rings of Power a little bit too, when the philosophy is so opposite the philosophy of the original author. It goes in the exact opposite direction. You've missed the point of the story. And I think a lesser example of this is actually the Prince Caspian movie from the last adaptations that were made a few years ago. Lewis tells the story in a very specific way. He unravels the details of that story in a certain chronology that allows the audience and the Pevensey children to experience things in a particular order. And it's so that the audience can wrestle with the question of if Aslan is still around and how active he is. This is one of the underlying tensions of that story. The bad guy is an explicit materialist in the book. The book asks the Pevensey children and Caspian to reject this materialism of Miraz, Caspian's uncle, and trust that just like Aslan was faithful in the past, Aslan will be faithful again. They need to put their faith in something that they can't see at the moment. And that's not really the question of the movie. And, I mean, it is, but to a much lesser degree, a much more tamed degree. And so the movie, I think, misses this major theme. And it misses this theme by cutting out several scenes, revealing details in a certain order that was different than they were revealed in the book, and in not driving home the materialism, the anti-mysticism of the bad guys in the story, and also by minimizing certain attributes of the heroes. And so I think it missed Lewis's philosophy. It was still a decent movie. So I don't want to, that was not the worst of the three that was made, but I think it wasn't as good, partially, if not primarily, because it didn't understand what Lewis was doing and why Lewis was asking the questions he was asking and posing the answers he was posing. So that is my 5 things that I think Greta Gerwig and Netflix need to avoid. And we'll see how they do. That's a lot of ways that they can go wrong, and honestly, at least a few ways that I think they probably will, especially given the way that entertainment has been made recently. But we'll see.